Good morning, good morning, good morning. It is 5:30 in the morning on a Thursday morning. We are recording in the mornings at 5:30 in the morning is when we come downstairs and we do our daily sketch. We do our daily practice sketch habit. We take we, in the royal sense, no, it's we if you are drawing along with me because I put the reference photo on my YouTube page. I take a toy out of the toy box, a random object out of what I lovingly call the Random Object Randomogrifier, throw it up on this stage here, and then I draw it. And so this morning we're going to do a teepee, Native American teepee. And there's question about whether or not it's a teepee, T-E-E, P-E-E, or whether it's a teepee, T-I-P-I. And I have seen in some of the comment sections of the websites I was going through yesterday, I've seen people vehemently arguing about whether or not it's all E's or all I's. And the thing that I get out of it is the Lakotas didn't have a written language. There's no way to misspell it. This is based on a Native American tribe, the Lakotas, the Dakotas, the Plains Indians, really, but specifically the Lakotas, and they didn't have a written language. So how can you misspell something that didn't have a spelling? How can you argue about misspelling something that didn't have a spelling? So I didn't think that was worth arguing over, but I thought it was an interesting opening discussion because you're talking about a civilization that has been around for thousands of years, that the only thing we know about them are the stories that they left behind because there's no written language. You know, look how far civilization has advanced. Look how far we've come just in the last 100 years because of our written language, because of our ability to communicate to the next generation where we left off. So the next generation can pick up where we left off and keep going forward. But with no written language, with just an oral tradition, you can't really do that. You can't really grow off of the changes of the previous generation. You can't really grow off the successes of the previous generation. The teepees have been around. The specific style of teepee where they put the sticks up, they build a base with circles on the ground, with stones on the ground, and they stake it into the ground and build it up just a specific way with either skin or canvas. The teepee in that fashion has been around for about 9,000 years. And the site that they found that is 9,000 years old, they're not sure if it's a teepee. There's another type of housing, if you will, that is very similar in the base, the way it's set up in the base, and in the construction, it's very similar, but it uses bark and wood to cover the sticks, and so it's enough different from a teepee that it has its own name. And God help me, sitting here, I cannot remember what the name of it was, and I was all prepared to talk about that just before the cameras turned on, but I cannot come up with the name while I'm sitting here, and I'd have to pull my phone down to look it up. Maybe one of y'all could look it up, but they're not sure if the thing from 9,000 years ago was a teepee or this, but it's the same base technology on the ground. During my adventure down the rabbit hole yesterday, learning about teepees and the like, I became curious if there was a similar structure in the European indigenous peoples, and it turns out that the Scandinavians had a similar structure called a lavu. And the lavu is a little shorter, a little broader based, and it stands up to high winds as one would on the Scandinavian, as one would need on the Scandinavian plans. It stands up to the high winds easier, better. And the kicker for me is the lavu was in use, has been in use for about 2,000 years. And that predates contact with the Native Americans, with the indigenous people of the Americas. By about 500 years, if not more. Now the question is did they have some kind of contact with the Native Americans that would have allowed them to learn about teepees and their ease of use for hunting and following the herds? Was there some way for that information to move back and forth across the Bering Straits? But the indigenous peoples of Eurasia that were closer to the Bering Straits had a different style of tent like this, and it was a cylinder on the ground, more like a circus tent, if you will. It was a cylinder on the ground with a conical top. So the only similarity there is the conical top. So it would be difficult for me to comprehend how the Scandinavians would pick up such a similar structure if the people closest to the strait weren't also using a similar structure. Did Leif Erikson? I started off with the wrong pen. If you didn't notice, I started off with the wrong pen. Hopefully that won't bleed too much when we go to watercolor. Did Leif Erikson, did the Vikings, whom we know had contact with the Native Americans prior to 1492, did he take the technology of the teepee back to the Scandinavians? And while that's a possibility, that is in the 700s or 800s. That is not 1,000 years prior. That is not. They think the Scandinavians were using the lavus. They think they've been using them for about 3,000 years. So about that puts it 1,000 years before Leif Erikson is known to have gone to the Americas. Is suspected of going to the Americas. So that makes that unlikely. But it's curious. It's curious. It's specifically a teepee because it has that flap at the top to let the smoke from the paint out, from the fire out paint. To let the smoke from the fire out of the tent. That makes it specifically a teepee, and not just a tent. There were lots of lodgings at the time, but they didn't all have that chimney stack in them that differentiates teepees from the other tents. My best guess, and I'm not, obviously this is just from a day's worth of reading blog posts and Wikipedia sites. But if I had to make a guess on how the similarities between the two things came about, I would argue the triangles are very stable. That's similar to the pyramids of Egypt and the pyramids of the Incas and the pyramids of the Mayans and Aztecs. The best way to stack, the most stable way to stack rocks is in a triangle. People can say, "Oh no, it's aliens, it's Egyptians," but the best way to stack rocks is in a triangle. The most stable way to stack rocks is in a triangle. and so there's no real mystery as to why those are similar. So it may simply be they're only similar because that's the most stable way to lean sticks up against each other and drape it with canvas or skin. I'll tell you what I did learn yesterday that was really interesting. Something that I've never heard talked about in American schools. One of the things that made teepees so important to the Plains Indians was his ability to tear down and move the hunting site to follow the herd. But these poles can be 15 to 20 feet long, and the skins that wrap them can be quite heavy. You know, how did they get around? Because horses weren't introduced into the Americas until 1492. There were no large animals that were domesticated to. There were no large domesticated animals to pull the sleds, to pull the teepees, to carry the teepees around from place to place. How did they move the teepees around from place to place? And I think it's interesting that this was never discussed in my education. But the Plains Indians, and it's only the Plains Indians that primarily had teepees. So the Cherokee didn't have teepees. The Hopi didn't have teepees. It's only the Plains Indians. A lot of Indians lived in caves or carve-outs or long cabins, long sweat lodges. A lot of Native Americans lived in different types of structures. It's only the Plains Indians, and sometimes it was year-round, and sometimes it was just during the hunting season. But how did they carry their tents around with them when they didn't have any horses? And it turns out that they had a special breed of dog similar to their Inuit cousins. And it's a special breed of dog that doesn't exist anymore. Because it was a dog that would have been brought across the strait, but they didn't bring tens of thousands of dogs across the strait. They just brought hundreds of dogs across the strait as they came across. Now, granted, they came across several times, and so there's several different times that these dogs were bred back into the system. But they also bred those dogs with wolves and coyotes. So that breed of dog only existed in the Americas, and it has been completely replaced by the Eurasian dog breeds that the Europeans brought when they colonized, when they came into the Americas. So they found remains of the dog that the Native Americans used. They know it existed. They've tested. They actually have DNA evidence because it's only from a couple of hundred years ago that these things existed. So there's actual DNA evidence. And they can test it against modern dogs, and they can test it against coyotes, and they can test it against the other animals. But never once in school was I taught that the Native Americans had dog breeds that would pull their travois, hey Kirthana, that would pull their travois sleds. And they had, never once was I taught in school that they had special dogs that would pull their sleds. So that was something I learned yesterday. I thought was fairly interesting. How are we doing on time? Oh, it's 5:51. We're way ahead of schedule. We have about 10 minutes left. I need to dry this, and then we can go back in with the inks. So yeah, let me hit that drop shadow one more time. And I'm going to dry this. And then we'll come back in and we'll ink it. Yeah, that's what we're going to do. I've said that 3 times now. That means that's the plan, right? Whoa! Nothing more exciting than watching paint dry. I wake up every morning excited about running downstairs and watching the paint dry. It is without doubt one of my favorite pastimes. Alright, that's enough of that nonsense. Now we can just move on to the final inking and be done with it. Now the other interesting thing that I found out yesterday was that while it was primarily the Plains Indians, Lakotas, Dakotas, Comanches, Apaches, while it was primarily the Plains Indians that used teepees originally, after the introduction of the horse, after the Europeans showed up and the Native Americans started using horses, it didn't take very long for the natives Native Americans to master horse riding, and so much so that there were legends that the riders the riders were legendary, especially the Comanche. Their ability to ride was just astounding. How quickly, as a culture, they picked it up and mastered it. But Comanche were already Plains Indians, so they were already utilizing teepees. But there were other native tribes that were not using teepees, that once it became easier to move them around with horses, they began using teepees. They started moving around and meeting up with other tribes that were using teepees, and they picked up the technology and they started using teepees also. Now, they were probably aware of teepees prior to that, but without horses to move them around, and apparently without the right kind of dog, because many of the tribes, especially in and around the Rockies, many of those tribes would eat dog. Dog is a fine meal, to quote Mel Gibson on The Patriot. Many of the tribes at the time around and west of the Rockies would actually eat dog. So they wouldn't have kept dogs to pull the sleds. So once they picked up the horse culture, it became easier for them to use the teepee technology. But I think we're going to call that done right at 5:58 on the 5th, 05 June. We're about halfway through the book. Yesterday was the halfway point on this new book. I think we're going to go ahead and do the other book so we can get a solid 60 days of ink and wash before we move on to another type of sketching, if we decide to move on to another type of sketching. So that's not really my perspective. My perspective was a little different from the picture that's available to you right there. That picture was taken last night, but when I sat down this morning, it's just a little different. But I mean, we're fairly close there. Let me put it up here so you can see it. And then we'll get a picture of it to put online. There we go. From my perspective, that's a pretty good match. This is what we have from my perspective, and once again, it tries to make sure I'm not blinding myself in the darkness. So there's our illustration this morning of the Native American teepee. Fun little sketch, fun little ink and wash, watercolor. I appreciate you guys joining me. I really do. I look forward to this every morning. This is when I meet with my art buddies with my accountability to make sure that I maintain my art practice, make sure I maintain my at least daily exposure to art. It gets me wired up for the whole rest of the day, and I really appreciate it. And I look forward to doing it again with you tomorrow. Same Artistic Biker time, same Artistic Biker channel. And then we dance. We dance until somebody says they see me dancing, because that lets me know that the lag has caught up with the stream and I don't have to worry about, oh look, coffee.